Thank you, Hannah. I'm happy to be here. I guess I'm here in multiple capacities as the chair of the Department of Communication and Media Studies, as the faculty advisor for our chapter of the Public Relations Student Society of America, and as a founding board member and past president of the Northwest Pennsylvania chapter of the Public Relations Society of America. This is a joint the university, our department, our PRSSA chapter, and the professional PRSA chapter have all joined together to bring Steve here today. So on behalf of the university, our student chapter, the professional chapter, I welcome everyone here this evening. It's interesting. It's very gracious of Steve to be here. We have one of the top political journalists in the country here in Compton Hall on Edinboro University in the middle of the what's been a really hotly contested Republican nomination for president. And it's a tribute to him because though he works out of Washington, D.C. with C-SPAN, he obviously has been hopping around the country covering these primaries, and we really owe a lot to Steve for his flexibility and really the generosity of his time. He's been on our campus all day. He spoke at lunch. We have a high school journalism day. We had 200 high school journalists here earlier. Steve was the luncheon speaker there, and here he is back this evening. He's well known. It's his status as one of the top political journalists in the country really is not disputed. I'll just finish my introduction of him. I know he's probably going to talk a little bit about social media and the role of social media, and my students are here. They'll pass out, and so will some of my former students pass out to hear me talk about technology. But this is a very exciting day for me personally, and I know you're all familiar with Facebook. Most of you are familiar with what many people consider to be the professional version of Facebook, LinkedIn, which is based loosely on the philosophy of the 6 degrees of separation, that if you're not directly connected with someone, you know someone who is, and you're able now through technology to connect technologically. And it's interesting because I graduated from Edinboro University in 1983, and I was accepted into the graduate program, the journalism program at American University in Washington, D.C. And when I arrived there, my GA, I was assigned to the television studio, and my GA supervisor, one of the first things he said to me in 1983 in Washington, D.C. was, "You have to know Steve Scully." And that's because Steve had been an undergraduate at AU, and my faculty supervisor knew that I was coming from an institution near the Erie area, and that Steve had worked in Erie. And I had to say, well, I don't really know Steve. I mean, he was working for WSEE then, probably a rookie or near a rookie reporter, and so I had remembered seeing him on air, but I really had no, when John Doolittle, who Steve and I were talking today, is not retired. He's still teaching. He's still on the faculty at American. He was the first person, that brought up that figured I had to know Steve Scully. So, students, that should really impress you when I throw out dates like 1983. But this is an exciting day for me because almost 30 years later, I actually have had the chance to meet Steve Scully. So please welcome him here to Edinboro University.
Thank you. It is a small world. I'll tell you something later about coming full circle, and you can ask the question about Vice President Cheney. But I want to thank President Moran as well for his hospitality. And where's Hannah? Hannah, thank you very much. There you are over there. And to Tony. This is really, for me to come back to my hometown and to be here in Erie is a thrill and an honor. So I appreciate you giving me a reason to come back home. And the Clarion Hotel is a great hotel. So thank you very much. Truth be told, did not go to Edinboro University. I applied here. I applied at Gannon. I applied at a number of institutions in Washington, D.C. Edinboro did accept me. I guess I was one of the 41% who didn't attend here. But I had 4 of 7 brothers who attended, and somehow they all graduated from Edinboro University, or as we like to call it, the Harvard on Lake Erie. And I spent many weekends here on the campus, so I can attest to really the warmth of this school. So thank you very much. And President Moran, I'm just walking around. What an incredible campus. This facility, I'm going to send a photo to Ann Compton, who's a friend of mine. If you ever want to get a great speaker, Ann Compton has been covering the White House since 1975. And she is still at the White House to this day. Her middle daughter is about to get married, and she's a great friend and has tremendous stories about covering first ladies and presidents from Betty Ford and Jerry Ford all the way to Barack Obama. So to the Public Relations Association Society, thank you for the invite. What I want to do is talk a little bit, maybe for about 10, 15 minutes, about C-SPAN, where we are, where this campaign is. I have a couple of examples I want to share with you, and I really want to have a conversation. So if that works for you, we'll take your questions. We began as a network back in 1979. And as I was telling the high school students today, technology has changed, and the way we distribute information has changed significantly with the web and with radio and with television. The quality has improved significantly. But our core mission has not changed. And it's what I tell journalism students as well, is that technology can help you get the message out to viewers and readers and listeners, but a good story is a good story, regardless of how it's distributed. And so what I tell young people is make sure you deal with the fundamentals. Good writing, good questions, well edited, because that at the end of the day is going to stand the test of time. It doesn't matter how snazzy it is, as long as the message isn't there or the story isn't interesting, you're not going to generate interest. Winston Churchill didn't have C-SPAN in mind when he talked about government, but we were recently criticized by Saxby Chambliss, Republican senator from Georgia, who thought that C-SPAN has brought down the politics of our country. But Winston Churchill, who said this, that many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in this world, and no one pretends that this democracy, and this is a quote, is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. And so what I would say is that the same is true about America's electoral system and America's political process. So what you do here at Edinboro is an example of trying to distill the importance of democracy and government and education. You're kind of a microcosm of what we do as a network, which is opening up the process and serve as an educational tool to the American people. So let me begin with a couple of examples, if I could. And I guess I should probably begin with the obvious, and that is defining what politics is all about. One of the best writers in the business is right here, Jeff Pinsky, who was always so sharp with his prose and his words with the Erie Daily Times. For how many years, Jeff? 35, 40 years? 40 years. But Jeff was one, he's like, in Washington, you have to read Dan Balls. In Erie, you had to read what Jeff Pinsky was writing about. Well, politics, if you don't know, comes from ancient Greece, and it is modeled after Aristotle's Affairs of the City, and it's really a reference to citizens making decisions, and that's really what we're all about. I told students today that covering Erie government, covering city council, is no different than covering Washington, D.C. Yes, the issues are different and maybe more complex, but politics is the art of people dealing with people and citizens trying to get involved, dealing with their government and their process. The other thing I would say is that this election is an important one, and every election has its consequences. But if you look at what's on the table right now, $16 trillion budget deficit, economic competition from countries like China and Thailand, throughout Europe and India, and a sharp polarization of American politics. And I would argue that what's going to happen in this campaign will really shape, I think, the next decade of our country. So let me frame my comments with 3 key points. First of all, where we are as a nation. Second of all, as Tony had indicated, I want to talk a little bit about technology and how that's changed and influenced how people make up their minds, how decisions are made. And then I want to talk a little bit about money in politics, because you can't talk about where we are in American politics without fully understanding what we have faced with the Supreme Court decision. You may agree or disagree with that decision, but it has opened up money in a way that we haven't really seen since before Watergate. Now, every election has kind of that narrative. That's really politics 101. If you go back to 1980, it was that Reagan narrative, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? If you go back to 1860 with the election of Abraham Lincoln, where really the country's future was to be decided. Or you go back to 1932, the rejection of Herbert Hoover and the election of Franklin Roosevelt. Or 2008, in which you had that change message that was so important to Barack Obama. And if you look at where we are as a country today, I think the Washington Post probably had the headline better than anyone else. It is one frustrated U.S. electorate. And when I saw that headline, I began to think, well, where is the frustration and why is it different today than 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the height of the civil rights movement, the anti-war protests that went to this campus in the late 1960s and campuses around the country. And I began to kind of think about the narrative of this election. And part of that narrative can be felt with what this campaign is all about. In 1992, James Carville had that famous line, "It's about the economy, stupid." Well, in 2012, it's about jobs. That is going to be the deciding issue in this election, barring some other national or international disaster, which I hope we don't feel. But if you're here in Erie, here in Edinboro, Pennsylvania, you go to Youngstown, Ohio, you go to Detroit, where communities are shrinking. I was talking to Kim Thomas earlier today about the congressional district in northwest Pennsylvania being divided now in Erie with 2 members of Congress. Well, that is a reality of a shrinking population. The headline this morning in the Erie Times, where 3 schools in the city of Erie will be closing down. Catholic schools in the city of Erie may have to shut down because there aren't enough students to go to those schools. But what you're facing is no different than what cities from upstate New York all the way through the so-called industrial Rust Belt have been feeling over the last 20 or 30 years. So why is this happening? Why are we facing such a sharp decline? Well, you can point to the Industrial Revolution, and you can look at what we faced back in the 1930s and 40s and 50s in this community where General Electric and Hammermill were growing and creating jobs. And that's kind of the old technology. And those jobs have long gone. What you have to be able to do is to be adaptable in this changing environment. And it's why what you do here at Edinboro is so important, because your generation, all of you out there, you've got to have the skills that will allow you to take on the jobs that may not even be there. I mean, Google wasn't even around 10 years ago, 5 years ago. It's changed significantly. And we take it for granted now. We wonder, what did we do without email? Well, I know what I did without email. You used to send letters, or you used to have to distribute things, in memo form. And so things have changed significantly, and it's hard for a lot of you to really understand because you've grown up with this. You haven't really witnessed this huge transformation similar to what I think we had at the turn of the 20th century with the Industrial Revolution. The other thing to keep in mind is that in this competitive environment, we have got to stay competitive. And I want to give you one example. Tom Friedman, New York Times, one of the greatest writers, said that when he was a child, his parents would tell him to make sure that he ate his food because there are children in India and China who are going to bed hungry. Now he tells his kids, get a good education because there are kids in India and China who want your job. This is not just competition from Pennsylvania to New York or Ohio trying to get the jobs. This is a global competition. And it is something that gets even beyond, I think, the current unemployment rate. Again, let me go back to that thought about that headline from the Washington Post, one frustrated U.S. electorate. I like to try to take the long view when I look at issues. And so when I go back over the last 10 years, one of the hallmark events, one of the most tragic events, was what happened on the morning of September 11, 2001. It was interesting. I had just come back from Oklahoma. We had done a series of programs called American Writers. And so I was in Oklahoma doing a program. I came back the evening, Monday, September the 10th. And that next morning I was on television doing the Washington Journal. And at about 8:45 was the first plane that hit the first tower. And I got a bulletin at about 8:52 that a plane crashed inside the World Trade Center. Thinking, like most Americans, what an awful accident on a day that New York and D.C. are no different. How could this have happened? We went to the House of Representatives at 9 o'clock. I walked out of the studio, turned the corner, saw the monitor, and saw the second plane hitting the second tower. And I mention that moment because it was a transformational moment for your generation and for the country as a whole. Because what happened on that day really struck the very psyche, I think, of the American people. We, for the first time in a generation, and my parents' generation had dealt with Pearl Harbor, and generations before that had dealt with the Civil War and World War I, but this was our moment in which we realized, wow, we are vulnerable. And it affected us in a lot of different ways. I mean, just look here in Erie, Tom Ridge, the governor who had the best job at the best point of his career, left the job to go down to Washington to eventually become the first Homeland Security Secretary. But beyond all of that, it affected the way we lived, it affected the way we traveled, it affected the way we thought about ourselves, and it led us into 2 wars. And when President Bush had a budget surplus when he entered office, a budget deficit when he left office. Now, you can argue the wars were right or the wars were wrong, and I'm not here to really criticize or support the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but the fact is that they happened, and they did lead to a growing deficit and a lot of uneasiness in the country because of these 2 wars, one that is now just about over and the other that is winding down. You know, my parents, and they talk about this, and Tom Brokaw, who we're going to be interviewing next month in a C-SPAN interview, wrote The Greatest Generation. And my grandparents and parents did live through the Greatest Generation because they did fight fascism, and they did fight Hitler, and they did turn the country into a robust period of growth in the 1940s and 50s. But what is so different today is that that war had an end. You know, when that flag went up at Iwo Jima, it was over. When we saw the changes going on in Germany, we knew that Germany was going to be an ally, not an enemy. Today, Japan is one of our strongest partners, but this is a different war. It's a different kind of enemy. So it goes back to what I said earlier, a different psyche that's affecting the American people. And that was really a huge driving force in 2008. If you look at George Bush's win in 2004 for re-election, he basically ran as a president who was going to keep the country safe. We were still feeling the effects of September 11th, and George Bush was able to win re-election. That began to change in 2006 when the Democrats, for the first time in 12 years, were able to pick up the House of Representatives. It changed again in 2008 when the change message of Barack Obama was so strong that he was able to win a record number of states. And of course, it happened again in 2010 when the Republicans get back control of the House. So again, I'll let the historians judge 2 wars and a budget deficit. Those are the facts, and the Bush administration will come back and say, well, we were faced with an enemy and we had to fight these wars, and they're absolutely right. Critics will say we might have fought the wrong war in Iraq, maybe it was the right war in Afghanistan. It is something that you really need to give probably 20 or 30 or 40 years of revisionist history to find out whether or not that was right or wrong. And in the case in point, of course, is Harry Truman, who left office in 1953 with record low approval ratings and now is revered as one of our greatest presidents in the country. So let me talk about the campaign, which is my second point. And that is one obvious point: the right candidate with the right message at the right time wins. I mean, that's politics 101. But the other thing is that we have a campaign and a process, and I want to talk about Citizens United in just a couple of minutes, that has really changed the playing field for the candidates. Let me give you a historical example, though. There was a Democratic candidate for president who had been in office for only a few years. Many said he didn't have enough experience. He didn't face re-election by voters, and the country was yearning for something different. And I'm not talking about Barack Obama. I'm talking about Woodrow Wilson back in 1912, who ran against 2 presidents. He ran against, of course, Taft, but also Teddy Roosevelt, who ran as the Bull Moose candidate in 1912, and was able to win a record number of states. He carried 40 states back in 1912 and 435 electoral votes. So you're probably asking yourself, well, why is that relevant today? In 1916, when Wilson was running for re-election, he won only 277 electoral votes. And we could potentially have the first time since Woodrow Wilson where you have an incumbent president who is re-elected with fewer electoral votes in his re-election than he got in his first go-around. So possibly, potentially, Barack Obama could face that in 2016. So it'd be interesting if 100 years later, history does repeat itself. In 2008, Obama won with about 365 electoral votes, and he won states that are very much now in the battleground: Indiana, Virginia, Nevada, and Florida. And so those really are the new battleground states in 2012. I was telling the students today, and they were asking me why I do what I do. And the most obvious reason is that I have an incredible chance to see history unfold and to see it through its first draft as a reporter, and to be able to experience the places that I've been able to go and the people I've been able to interview and the events that I've been able to witness in 20 years, covering Washington, covering the White House, covering politics dating back to 1992. It has been an incredible opportunity, and no day is different, and every day is interesting. There are a couple of memorable interviews that I want to share with you, and they were both with sitting presidents. In 2001, I sat down with Bill Clinton, or in 2001, I sat down with with Bill Clinton. In 2008, I sat down with George W. Bush. And there were these final interviews before they left the White House. And it was interesting as you look back at their career, especially with President Bush, who kept talking about being a uniter, a compassionate conservative, and yet he had record low approval ratings. The Republican Party did not even really want him at the Republican convention in 2008, and he really faced an angry electorate. And so the question I asked him is, what happened? You know, why did you come in with such great promise, and why were you unable to change things? He was very honest. He talked about the fact that the city was polarizing. He thought he could unite the country. He thought he could unite Democrats and Republicans. He thought that they could work together on key issues, and he did have some success. The No Child Left Behind was a hallmark in terms of bipartisanship, with Ted Kennedy supporting George W. Bush. But it does get to the bigger issue of the acrimony that we face in Washington. And I asked Bill Clinton the same question. And what was amazing about Bill Clinton is his ability to kind of move beyond that. He really didn't want to talk about the impeachment. He didn't want to talk about the animosity that he faced, because he wanted to talk about the good things that had worked in his 8 years in the White House, and also what he was going to do as a post-president. There's a new book, by the way, coming out. Time Magazine has a cover story looking at the most exclusive club in the country, which is former presidents. And it goes back to the agreement that Harry Truman had with Herbert Hoover back in 1953. And that really began this post-presidency presidential club that we see with George W. Bush the other day, speaking for the first time in really about 2.5 years. One of the other things he told me in the interview is he's going to walk off the stage, and he's not going to come back and try to second-guess Barack Obama. And you know what? He's been true to his word. I think as a sitting president, there were some former presidents who he didn't appreciate, because they would weigh in on certain issues, and I'm not going to name the former presidents, but you can figure out who they are, and he didn't appreciate that as president. So to his credit, he said what he was going to do, and he did what he said he was going to do. The other thing I wanted to talk about is this campaign, and if you look at where Mitt Romney is right now, he has been criticized because people have said, well, he's a flip-flopper, and the base doesn't trust him. And those are issues that he's really had to deal with in this primary challenge that now has ended, much to the dismay of WJET and all the stations here in Erie that were hoping to get all that advertising money. I told Pam Foster at, is it Foster? At WICU, that the Romney campaign was ready to spend about $3 or $4 million in the next week, and another $3 million in the final week. And she says, oh no, there's all our money that's gone down the drain, because they didn't get it. So anyhow, the point about Mitt Romney, some of the very issues that may have hurt him in the primary could actually help him in the general election. And I think as you look at these poll numbers right now, which are right now showing that the president is at 51, 52%, and Romney is at 42, 43%, don't believe them. I mean, yeah, the polls, they're a snapshot. They tell you right now what's going to happen. This thing is going to change, and it could change to the president's favor. It could certainly change to Mitt Romney's favor. We have a long way to go before the general election, and the conventional wisdom right now is that the president will be reelected. Typically, a president is reelected, and he might be reelected. When people ask me who's going to win, I give them an honest answer. I do not know, but I don't think a lot of people really know, because the economy is going to be, I think, I know, the driving force in this election, and how you frame the debate will really be instrumental in terms of how the president does and how the the Republicans do. Now, a little bit about my own network. To paraphrase Harry Truman, since we were talking about him, he said that, well, what I say is that C-SPAN never gives people hell. We tell people what's happening. They may think it's hell, but we're out there to try to put a spotlight on what's happening across the country. And what we have been facing really in this media environment is, I think, even a higher decibel of criticism around the country. And a lot of that is coming from cable. A lot of that is coming from opinion journalism. We like to call ourselves the Switzerland of the media because we're not really out there to tell you what to think or how to think. We just want to present the facts and then let you think for yourselves, whether it's a speech or a policy issue or a hearing or a political event. And that's what makes us unique and different. We are funded by the cable industry. We get about 5 cents per month per cable subscriber. We are the only place anywhere in the world that has this kind of business model, and it is a luxury, believe me, when we don't have to face the pressure of advertising dollars, that we can sit down with these public officials and have a long, thoughtful conversation. It is a joy to have a half hour or 45 minutes with key individuals who are shaping the country's agenda and really flesh out, and then have viewers come in and weigh in on certain issues. Every morning we do a 3-hour program. We get about 60 calls. And we get the tweets and the emails, and it really is a conversation and a dialogue. You're not going to get that anywhere else. And we realize that we also have our most important commodity, which is our reputation. And we try to play it straight. We get criticized from all fronts. People claim I'm a Republican. They claim I'm a Democrat. They claim I'm a socialist. They claim I'm a communist. So if they all say that, then I might be doing something right, because then they can come up with their own decisions. Hopefully, they don't know where I'm coming from, because the focus isn't really about me. It's about the people who we're interviewing or talking about. But if you listen to Bill O'Reilly or Sean Hannity or Ed Schultz or Joe Scarborough, you know where they're coming from, and that's fine. I mean, we all are consumers of news, and you have to be skeptical of news. You have to do your own due diligence, but you also have to understand that if you're a conservative, you might want to read the New York Times editorial page. And if you're a liberal, you should read the Wall Street Journal editorial page. You have to understand where all points of view are coming from. And that's what we try to do as a network. I have no more inside knowledge about events that we cover than you do if you watch the entire event. What has changed, and that's been a benefit, is that technology. We're able to, if John McCain in 2008 were coming to this campus, or Mitt Romney or Barack Obama, we'd have a camera outside to show the bus or the motorcade pulling in and give you a sense of what it's like outside. And just watch it. Not talk over it, just watch it. And then let you watch the speech. And then afterwards open up our phone lines and get viewers to comment on it. Or to sit down with newsmakers and have a thoughtful discussion about housing issues, or about race relations, or about education. And do it in a way that is respectful of the issues and the process, and respectful of you as viewers and listeners and readers. Some historical perspective, and you were talking, Tony, about the internet. Does anyone have any idea when the first campaign, I'm going to look at you, when was the first campaign website, presidential campaign website? What's your name? Right there in the front. Yes? Mm-hmm. Just take a guess. Obama's campaign in 2008? A little bit further back. Anyone else? First presidential campaign website. What year were you born? 1994. First campaign website was 2 years later, when you were 2 years old. Bill Clinton and Bob Dole. But think about that. That was only 16 years ago. In 1996, the first campaign websites. You look at the arc of technology. You look at how things have changed. They did something revolutionary. They posted speeches on their websites. And then in 1998, when Newsweek magazine had this blockbuster story about the President of the United States and an intern, and Newsweek blocked the story, what happened? What happened? You know what happened? Jeff Pinsky knows what happened. Matt Drudge posted it on his website, and it was everywhere. The point is that the days where you have the gatekeepers, where if the New York Times kills a story, you're not going to see it anywhere else, those days are gone. The days where campaigns are trying to have a one-on-one, it's a multi-dimensional conversation. In 1996 was the first campaign website. Then you move ahead to 2000. John McCain used the website to raise money, which was revolutionary. Back in the 1970s, when George McGovern was running for president, he asked people to send in a contribution. Now you could just go online and click on a contribution. 2004, Howard Dean took that to another step further, where he was able to raise a lot of money to stay in the race in 2004 before his shriek in Iowa that we all are so familiar with. And then, of course, in 2008, Barack Obama took it one step further. He realized that delegates in all states were equally as important, whereas the Hillary Clinton campaign was running a campaign over 18 states to win Iowa, to win New Hampshire, to win the early states. Barack Obama was getting delegates in Idaho and Utah and in his home state of Hawaii. He used the internet. And so as we move into 2012, and Kim had asked me the question this morning about what's different, what's changed, there are two things. One is money, a lot more money in 2012 than 2008, and the other is the internet. How social media, how Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn and all this has really changed. And we are only on the cusp of this. And there's so many more challenges going on in technology. And I say this if you're old enough to remember. My kids were watching the Jetsons the other day. It's a great cartoon in the 1960s, but what was interesting is everything they talked about in that cartoon has come to fruition, where you have technology that you have a little, what they call it, a wrist phone. You have now your iPad. I mean, everything that they were thinking about in the 60s has come today, and you wonder now, with companies like Kodak that have now all but disappeared, what are we going to see in the next 15, 20 years? What's the next Google? What's the next Twitter? Because it's out there, and there are more changes coming about that we cannot even imagine. Political note about this campaign: I teach students what's called a distance learning course, and I tell them that when they look at this campaign, it's going to come down to, of course, the economy, of course, jobs, but is it a referendum election or is it a choice election? If it's a referendum election, trouble. If it's a choice election, the president is reelected. So what the Romney campaign is going to try to do, and they have been doing, is they want to pin all the bad news on the president. The economy, gas prices, high unemployment. They want to make this a referendum, very much the way Reagan did so successfully in 1980. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? Here's an interesting thing to keep in mind. In the fall of 1980, Reagan and Carter were pretty much dead even in the polls until the week before the election. There was only one debate in 1980. It took place just down the road in Cleveland, Ohio. You don't remember this because you weren't around. You were born in 1994. But Carter didn't want to debate John Anderson, who's still alive, by the way. He's 90 years old, and Reagan together. So they finally agreed that they would have a one-on-one debate. And it was in that debate that the Carter people wanted to make Reagan look like a cowboy, somebody who was not up to the job. He got up there. He looked sharp. He looked smart. He asked that question: are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? Next day, poll numbers showed Reagan was up, Carter tanking, and Carter won 6, 7 states. I mean, it was a disaster for the president. But up until that debate, it was within the margin of error. Reagan was up in some polls, Carter was up in another. We could face that again in 2012, but there will be more than just one debate. And there will never be a debate a week before the election anymore. Now the debates are in late September and early October. So if it's a choice election, which is what the president wants it to be, then he's reelected. Because if it's a choice, he's going to say the other guy is unacceptable and I am acceptable. And I think that that's really, if you talk to David Axelrod, you talk to the people in the Democratic Party, that's what they're going to continue. They're going to continue to pound away at, is Mitt Romney acceptable? The other day, the president made the comment about marvelous. I don't know if you heard this or not, but Mitt Romney said that the budget put forth by Congressman Ryan is a marvelous budget. And the president said, marvelous. Who uses that word anymore? And it's clear what he was trying to do is to try to poke fun at Romney, to do whatever they can to make sure that he is not acceptable as president. I was talking before the class, Mitt Romney, we covered him yesterday. He had women behind him. He clearly knows that he has a problem with women. So he's going to try to do what he can to go after the women vote and make sure that he reminds the electorate, well, hey, unemployment is highest among women, blame the president. So choice and referendum are the two key things to keep in mind with this election. And then, as I said, my third point about money and politics. In 1976, which was really the first year that we had two leading candidates accepting federal dollars with the creation of the Federal Election Commission, the whole campaign, Democrats, Republicans, primary general election, came to a total of about $530 or $540 million. And then in 2000, collectively, overall, the campaign for George W. Bush and Al Gore reached $1 billion, cumulatively among the campaigns. And now, 12 years later, we'll have the president and his re-election effort and the so-called super PACs, just for the president, raising upwards of $750 million. And that doesn't even begin to account what the Republicans have spent in this primary and what Team Romney will spend in the general election. All of this, of course, is a clear result of Citizens United. Again, you can agree or disagree with the decision. It's obvious that it has opened up the floodgates of money in American politics. Now, we just finished Easter, and I think we spent, as a country, about $2 billion on Easter candy. So you could argue that this is money well spent when you're electing the leader of the free world, but it is still an awful lot of money. It also means a lot of money for people who want to run in local office. In this corner of Pennsylvania, when Phil English, and I did an interview with him, when he first ran in 1994, he told me he spent about $300,000 for his re-election effort, which he thought was an awful lot of money. And then when he was running in a very tough re-election battle against Kathy Dahlkemper, he had told me that he had spent about $2.5 million in 2010. And if he were to run in this district today, if he had a primary challenge and a general election challenge, he said it would be upwards of $5 million. Now this, folks, is just one campaign, one congressional district. But let me put it this way. Running for re-election, you have to raise every week, 52 weeks a year, for the 2 years that you're in office, on average, $10,000. So that gives you a sense of just how much money is out there and what a challenge it is for people who are running for elective office to deal with the political reality. You're getting money not only, you're getting hit not only from your opponent, but also from super PACs and from organizations that you don't even know about. And it is a real challenge. Now, you also have congressional districts that indicate that most members of Congress are reelected, and they are, but there are exceptions. Kathy Dahlkemper 2 years ago is one, and we'll see many more, I think, depending on what happens in this election in 2012. The other thing that's changed, and this goes back to the issue of technology, is the so-called invisible primary. Jimmy Carter, who I just did a lengthy interview with, I had asked him about this. He ran in 1975, but he ran as a nobody. I mean, he's a one-term former governor of Georgia, and yet he would come to small towns in Iowa and New Hampshire. He came to Erie. Didn't get a lot of media attention. You might have interviewed him, Jeff, but people didn't take him seriously until he started to win some primaries. But in all of 75, he got very little attention. He got some, but we didn't have YouTube. We didn't have the cable. We didn't have anything except the 3 networks, and so his visibility was limited. And those days are now gone. I'm going to show you an example of one of them. But you go from the invisible primary to today, the moment you announce, you are on the national stage. Everything that you say and do, every nuance, every mistake, pops up on YouTube. It drives the cable chatter. And it's just the new reality of where we're at. So let me conclude with a couple of points. First of all, for what I am able to do to have this front row seat to history is incredible. It's an opportunity. It's also an obligation. Politics is a fun spectator sport. I mean, let's face it. If you love politics like I do, it is interesting to watch all the machinations, all the ins and outs of the process. But at the end of the day, and this gets to my role as a citizen, things have to get done. And I want to paraphrase Sam Rayburn of Texas. He said that, I hope I can say this, any jackass, I just did, can kick down a barn, but it takes a carpenter to build one. Let me say that again. Any jackass can kick down the barn. It takes a carpenter to build one. And so what I try to do, and what my colleagues do at C-SPAN, led by Brian Lamb, who is the founder and really the guiding force of what we do, is present the facts and then let you as viewers and listeners come to your own conclusions. So here are the facts. Barring another September 11th event, the economy will be the driving force in this election. Money is going to play an even bigger role in 2012 than we've seen in any campaign since before Watergate. And in this global, interconnected world, we have a lot of challenges, and none more prevalent than here in this community, to adapt to that technology, to embrace it, and to use it in order to create jobs and opportunity for the citizens here in this corner of the state and around the country. David Brooks, who is somebody else that I read regularly, put it this way in the New York Times. He said, "The prognosis for the next few years is bad with a chance of worse, and the economic conditions are not even the scary part." He said, "The scary part is the political class's inability to think about the economy in a realistic way." Well, we are a nation that has been born and tempered by Civil War, 2 World Wars, Vietnam, Korea, and the Civil Rights Movement. These have been challenges and struggles that have really strengthened us as a country. And if you look at the Civil Rights Movement, it's a good example of ending the polarization and getting something done. Hubert Humphrey and Everett Dirksen were polar opposites, Democrat and Republican. And yet they both saw beyond the headlines of the day, and they both realized it is time to get beyond what we were facing as a country in 1963-64. And they embraced the Civil Rights Movement. And I use that as an example because they were able to get beyond that and realizing that for the greater good, not the political good of the moment, because it would have been very easy for an Everett Dirksen to walk away because the Republican Party didn't like it. It would have been very easy for Hubert Humphrey to walk away because Democrats in the South didn't feel that the Civil Rights the Civil Rights Bill should have been passed. I mean, it's hard to believe today in 2012 the fight that we were going through in 1961, 62, 63. But we are a better nation because of the Civil Rights Bill, and we're better as a country because the politicians got beyond that and were able to work together. So my advice, and I tell this to members of Congress, is that it would be great if politicians stopped talking at each other and once in a while begin talking to each other. It does happen from time to time, but I think if we have more of that as a citizen of this country, we're better off as a nation. So with that, let me share with you a couple of video moments, because we are a network, so I figured I'd not just speak for a long period of time, and then I'll open it up to your questions. The first thing I want to show, let me just see how to turn this on. Now this is, the monitor's off, so, oh, here we go. Should come on in a minute. Okay. I talk about YouTube moments. We were covering Mitt Romney. This is an event that takes place in Des Moines, Iowa every 4 years. It's called the Soapbox. And at this event, Mitt Romney knew that whatever he said was going to show up on YouTube. It goes back to that macaca moment with George Allen that doomed his Senate bid 6 years ago. This is an event that rarely got media attention, but now has become kind of the central location for politicians during the Iowa caucuses. It takes place in the summer before the caucuses, and let's just watch.
Governor Romney, I've been asking a non-question.
What's your name?
My name is Daniel Simmons. I'm
Daniel
23
Simmons,
years old.
you're 23, and where are you from? Who brought you here? Who are you working with?
Myself. Social
You
Security.
get a little video camera here. Okay, all right.
Social Security
All right.
legally cannot add a single dime to the deficit. Do you agree? I'm also a teacher. Do you agree that Social Security should take no part in deficit reduction negotiations? That Social Security should take no part in deficit reduction negotiations.
That's your question?
That's my question.
Okay, can I answer?
Answer it.
Do I believe that Social Security should take no part in deficit reduction negotiations? Is that the question?
It cannot add to the deficit.
And the answer is this. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid account for about half of federal spending.
A lie. Not the deficit.
Just hold on.
Federal losing. A lie.
Makes you want to run for president, doesn't it?
And if we are ultimately, not just this year, but over the coming decades, going to be able to balance our budget and not spend more than we take in, we have to make sure that the promises we make in social promises we can keep. And there are various ways of doing that. One is we can raise taxes on people. That's not the way. Corporations are people, my friend. We can raise taxes on. Of course they are. Everything corporations earn ultimately goes to people. So, where do you think it goes? Whose pockets? Whose pockets? People's pockets. Okay, human beings, my friend. So number one, you can raise taxes. You can raise taxes. That's not the approach that I would take. Number two, you can make sure that the promises we make are promises that we can keep. And in my view, the areas that you have to consider are higher income people receiving less rapid growth in their benefits and their inflators. If you don't agree with that, you want to give wealthier people a bigger portion, that's your right. I think we should have what's known as progressive indexing. I think we also should consider a higher retirement age. Those are things that should be considered as part. That's my view. You may disagree with it. That's my view. But my view is.
So there you have it. But the point about that corporations are people has really become a moniker by the Democrats. And but the Romney campaign, they were happy with that. We were the only ones covering this event live, and we did it live, not with a big KU truck, but it's called Live View, and it allows us to use cell phone technology to carry events. Now the problem is when there's a lot of cell phones in use, the quality of the picture diminishes. But this is one example of what's different, and we were able to do all of these events in Des Moines. We don't have to spend a lot of money on KU trucks, and we can do it live and be much more nimble. I want to thank Madeline earlier because she helped me out. I had one of the moments where I'm trying to think of the 3 justices of the Supreme Court today, and I couldn't think of Elena Kagan, so she helped me out. But I mention that because we can all appreciate, we all have moments where we're trying to remember the third element, and this, of course, was the defining moment for Rick Perry because it fit into the narrative, is he up to the job? So I think you know what I'm going to show you. Let's watch. And Madeline, thank you. And we're going to begin with one of the moments from the 2008 campaign as well. Because in her rehearsal, she kept calling him O'Biden. O'Biden. So that's why you got the, can I call you Joe?
It's 3 agencies of government when I get there that are gone. Commerce, education, and the, what's the third one there? Let's see. Oh, 5, okay. So commerce, education, and the EPA? EPA, there you go. Okay.
Seriously? Is EPA the one you were talking about?
No, sir. We're talking about the agencies of government. EPA needs to be rebuilt.
But you
no
can't,
doubt about
but you
that.
can't name the third one?
The third agency of government, yeah. I would do away with the education, commerce, and let's see. I can't. The third one I can't. Sorry. Oops.
The third was energy.
On the speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I want to start with that this evening. As you know, your ex-wife gave an interview to ABC News and another interview with the Washington Post, and this story has now gone viral on the internet. In it, she says that you came to her in 1999, at a time when you were having an affair. She says you asked her, sir, to enter into an open marriage. Would you like to take some time to respond to that?
No, but I will. I think the destructive, vicious, negative nature of much of the news media makes it harder to govern this country, harder to attract decent people to run for public office, and I am appalled that you would begin a presidential debate on a topic like that. Every person in here knows personal pain. Every person in here has had someone close to them go through painful things. To take an ex-wife and make it 2 days before the primary a significant question in a presidential campaign is as close to despicable as anything I can imagine. My two daughters wrote the head of ABC and made the point that it was wrong, that they should pull it, and I am frankly astounded that CNN would take trash like that and use it to open a presidential debate.
It gets better.
As you noted, Mr. Speaker, this story did not come from our network. As you also know, it is the subject of conversation on the campaign. I get your point. I take your point.
John, it was repeated by your network. You chose to start the debate with it. Don't try to blame somebody else. You and your staff chose to start this debate with us.
Governor Romney, when will we see yours? When my taxes are complete for this year, and I know that if I'm the nominee, the president's going to want to insist that I show what my income was this last year and so forth. When they're completed this year in April, I'll release my returns in April and probably for other years as well. And I know that's what's going to come. Every time the Democrats are out there trying their very best to try and attack people because they've been successful, and I have been successful.
Why not should the people of South Carolina, before this election, see last year's return?
Because I want to make sure that I beat President Obama. And every time we release things, drip by drip, the Democrats go out with another array of attacks. As has been done in the past, if I'm the nominee, I'll put these out at one time so we have one discussion of all of this. I obviously pay all full taxes. I'm honest in my dealings with people. People understand that. My taxes are carefully managed. And I pay a lot of taxes. I've been very successful. And when I have our taxes ready for this year, I'll release them.
Back in 1967, your father set a groundbreaking, what was then a groundbreaking standard in American politics. He released his tax returns. He released them for not 1 year, but for 12 years. And when he did that, he said this: 1 year could be a fluke, perhaps done for show. When you release yours, will you follow your father's example?
Maybe. I don't know how many years I'll release. I'll take a look at what our documents are. And I'll release multiple years. I don't know how many years, but I'll be happy to do that.
That's an example of politics becoming a spectator sport. This is an example of a record number of primary debates, driven in large part because the cable networks have found that it's a way for them to generate revenue and attention. When I first began at C-SPAN, we covered debates. We would simulcast WMUR's debate in New Hampshire or WHO's debate in Iowa. Those days are long gone because now the local stations are partnering with the networks and putting them on the air. This is also an example of the debates driving the election. Those two moments that you saw with Newt Gingrich and Mitt Romney, within a week, Mitt Romney released his taxes. And Newt Gingrich won the South Carolina primary shortly after that appearance. And of course, Rick Perry was out of the race after his losses in the early primary states. But that moment became the seminal moment for Rick Perry that, again, unfortunately for him, because he is a bright guy, but it fit into the narrative, is he up for the job? And when you're weeding out candidates, those become the moments that voters look at. Mitt Romney was very consistent during most of the debates, but that one moment on the taxes, he did stumble a little bit. Speaking of moments, any questions before I continue? Anyone? I want to share with you a historical moment, actually two of them, because debates may not change the election, but they can reinforce the existing view that people have of certain individuals. And the one example I want to show you is right here. Gerald Ford was often viewed as the accidental president, the guy who was never elected, was appointed by Richard Nixon as vice president, became our president, and had a couple of stumbles. Literally, he was in Vienna and he fell down the tarmac on Air Force One, and yet he was a very athletic individual. And then this moment, in a race that in the summer of 1976, Gerald Ford was 30 points down over Jimmy Carter. He lost by less than 2 percentage points. Had this moment not happened, you wonder if history would have been different. Would he have beaten Jimmy Carter? We don't know. But this did become a seminal moment because it reinforced the image that people had of Gerald Ford, and it allowed Carter at the very end of the process to gain momentum when it's obviously critical in any campaign to make sure you're on the upswing at the end. Just ask Rick Santorum in Iowa.
In the case of Helsinki, 35 nations signed an agreement, including the Secretary of State for the Vatican. I can't under any circumstances believe that His Holiness the Pope would agree by signing that agreement that the 35 nations have turned over to the Warsaw Pact nations the domination of Eastern Europe. It just isn't true. And if Mr. Carter alleges that His Holiness, by signing that, has done it, he is totally inaccurate. Now, what has been accomplished by the Helsinki Agreement? Number one, we have an agreement where they notify us and we notify them of any military maneuvers that are to be undertaken. They have done it in both cases where they've done so. There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration.
I'm sorry, could I just follow? Did I understand you to say, sir, that the Russians are not using Eastern Europe as their own sphere of influence and occupying most of the countries there and making sure with their troops that it's a communist zone, whereas on our side of the line, the Italians and the French are still flirting with
I don't believe, Mr. Franco, that the Yugoslavians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Romanians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Poles consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. Each of those countries is independent, autonomous. It has its own territorial integrity. And the United States does not concede that those countries are under the domination of the Soviet Union. As a matter of fact, I visited Poland, Yugoslavia, and Romania to make certain that the people of those countries understood that the President of the United States and the people of the United States are dedicated to their independence, their autonomy, and their freedom.
Governor Carter, for a response.
Well, in the first place, I'm not criticizing his holiness the Pope. I was talking about Mr. Ford. The fact is that secrecy has surrounded the decisions made by the Ford administration. In the case of the Helsinki Agreement, it may have been a good agreement at the beginning, but we have failed to enforce the so-called Basket 3 part, which ensures the right for people to migrate, to join their families, to be free, to speak out. The Soviet Union is still jamming Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Europe is being jammed. We've also seen a very serious problem with the so-called Seinfeld document, which apparently Mr. Ford has just endorsed, which said that there's an organic linkage between the Eastern European countries and the Soviet Union. And I would like to see Mr. Ford convince the Polish Americans, the Czech Americans, and the Hungarian Americans in this country that those countries don't live under the domination and supervision of the Soviet Union behind the Iron Curtain.
What's interesting about that moment is that the Ford campaign thought he answered the question pretty well, but some realized that they had a problem on their hands. That night, most people thought Gerald Ford had won the debate. But within 24 or 36 hours, as the news cycle began to develop, people realized that Ford made a big mistake. He later had to correct that mistake. Of course, today, it would be instantaneously. The Twitter feeds would say, you made a mistake. And it just shows you how different it was back in '76, not that long ago, to where we are today. Couple of other moments. Well, let me take you back to 1960. We talked about how CNN has used the debates and Fox and MSNBC. This is how the very first debate opened up in 1960, and I'm going to juxtapose that to where we are in 2012.
Good evening. The television and radio stations of the United States and their affiliated stations are proud to provide facilities for a discussion of issues in the current political campaign by the two major candidates for the presidency. The candidates
Look how nervous Nixon looks there.
And the Democratic candidate, Senator John F. Kennedy.
From the mountain majesty of the Rockies to the desert sands of the Mojave, the American frontier is a historic land of opportunity for Republicans. Tonight, the fight for the GOP presidential nomination comes here to a region where Barack Obama made inroads 4 years ago. To a state that could be decisive in the primary season and the general election. To a city where dreams are made and crushed. Stand by for a Las Vegas event.
It could be Jersey Shore, it could be WWF. It's a debate. It's a debate, folks, and that's just part. That went on for about 4 minutes. I didn't want to do the whole thing, but that is how the very first debate opened in 1960. I'm not saying that was pretty boring, and you don't have to be boring, but it just shows you where we are today with how these debates and how the political campaign has become 24/7 on cable. A couple of other examples, then I'm going to take more of your questions. In 1988, George Herbert Walker Bush wanted to do something different. He wanted to pluck somebody from obscurity and put this person on the ticket. And I think Dan Quayle and Sarah Palin have one thing in common. I think they were improperly vetted, and more significantly, they were rolled out in a very poor way that I think hurt Dan Quayle to this day, and of course I think it affected Sarah Palin as well. But this one moment in this one debate became a defining moment. Of course, Dan Quayle went on to serve his 4 years as vice president. Very smart, very sharp guy, but he was trying to draw the analogy, and Lloyd Bentsen was ready for him.
I will be prepared to carry out the responsibilities of the presidency of the United States of America. And I will be prepared to do that. I will be prepared not only because of my service in the Congress, but because of my ability to communicate and to lead. It is not just age, it's accomplishments, it's experience. I have far more experience than many others that sought the office of Vice President of this country. I have as much experience in the Congress as Jack Kennedy did when he sought the presidency. I will be prepared to deal with the people in the Bush administration if that unfortunate event would ever occur.
Senator Benson?
Senator, I served with Jack Kennedy. I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy. And a situation like that, is to call in the joint.
That was really uncalled for, Senator.
You're the one that was making the comparison, Senator, and I'm one who knew him well. And frankly, I think you're so far apart in the objectives you choose for your country that I did not think the comparison was well taken.
Hook story. Lloyd Bentsen wasn't really good friends with Jack Kennedy, but why let the facts get in the way of a good line? I'm going to talk to you for a minute, okay? Now, if I get real close, what do you think? You a little intimidated? If I get too close to you, what do you do? Right? Okay? The body language, this next moment. The bully in the sandbox. This, I think, if you look at what happened in 2000, you had a hot Al Gore, you had a cool Al Gore, and then you had kind of an in-between Al Gore. But this moment, you talk about defining the elections just like 1976, very much affected Gerald Ford. This is 2000.
Would you agree that you two agreed on a national patient's bill of rights?
Absolutely not. I referred to the Dingell-Norwood bill. It is the bipartisan bill that is now pending in the Congress. The HMOs and the insurance companies support the other bill that's pending, the one that the Republican majority has put forward. They like it because it doesn't accomplish what I think really needs to be accomplished, to give the decisions back to the doctors and nurses and to give you a right of appeal to somebody other than the HMO or insurance company, let you go to the nearest emergency room without having to call an HMO before you call 911, to let you see a specialist if you need to. And it has strong bipartisan support. It is being blocked by the Republican leadership in the Congress. And I specifically would like to know whether Governor Bush will support the Dingell-Norwood bill, which is the main one pending.
Governor Bush, you may answer that if you'd like, but also I'd like to know how you see the differences between the two of you, and we need to move on.
Well, the difference is that I can get it done. That I can get something positive done on behalf of the people. That's what the question in this campaign is about. It's not like what's your philosophy and what's your position on issues, but can you get things done?
All right. What about the Dingell-Norwood bill?
All right, we're going to go now.
I'm not quite through. Let me finish. Yes.
But that 4-second moment reinforced an image that people had of Al Gore of being, you know, Mr. Smarty Pants, the guy who was going to tell you what to do, and I think that clarified to a lot of voters on a high viewership night that I think hurt him. Last thing I want to share with you is people ask, what is this campaign all about? Well, if you look at the opening video of the Barack Obama 17-minute video, everything you want to know about what the strategy is for Barack Obama and his own re-election can be found right here. They want to remind you about where we were, but also what we were facing in 2008. Of course, the Republicans are going to say things could be better if we're elected. So let's just watch.
What do we remember in November of 2008? Was it this movement? Or this?
This is an economy right now that can't find the bottom of bad news.
10 years of saving completely gone, vanished. The proof.
Watching the Dow Industrial Average has been like watching the heart monitor on a critically ill patient.
How do we understand this president and his time in office? Do we look at the day's headlines, or do we remember what we as a country have been through?
Could be eerie.
The president-elect is here in Chicago. He named the members of the economic team, and they all fly in for the first big briefing on the economy. Many of the leading financial figures of the world are taking the subway in from the airport and traipsing through the snow to get to the transition aisle.
There was a screen set up for slides, but we might as well have been showing a horror movie because what was described in that meeting was an economic crisis beyond anything anybody had imagined.
We had people telling you that the auto industry was literally days from collapse. The financial sector, kind of the heart that pumps blood into the economy.
So then it goes on, what problem do we face, this one, or that one. The interesting thing about that video is the way it came about, and also to go back to the earlier point about technology. The Obama campaign very effectively teased it out. They sent some trailers, and then they gave it exclusively to the Today Show, and they ran it, and then the next day everyone else carried it, and then the 17-minute video was posted on its website, moderated by Tom Hanks, or narrated, and it showed you how they were really able to use this video and turn it into a pretty good marketing tool for the Obama campaign. And that doesn't cost them a dime to put on the air because it's never going to air on television. It's only on the web, so it's free, and yet it generates an awful lot of news coverage and media attention. So with that, if we have time, questions from anyone? Otherwise, I've answered them all. Yes?
You know, media versus money. Which one is going to carry the day?
Let's see, it's on camera here. You can all tweet it out. When you say media versus money in terms of...
The way that the Citizens United decision is
Mm-hmm.
affecting the campaign. Ultimately, the person that has an awful lot of money is going to carry the day because they are able to put up a lot more advertisements. They are linked, but we can separate them and look at the numbers.
Well, yes and no. I'll give you my opinion. Money is the mother's milk of politics, but there are a lot of candidates who have raised a lot of money, who have spent a lot of money, and have still lost. Because if there isn't a message behind the money, Meg Whitman in California, she should have won. She spent $120 million, imagine, to be governor of California, and she lost. In part because California is a Democratic state, but she also didn't have the message that people were looking for, and she was following another Republican governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger. So that's why my earlier point, the right candidate with the right message at the right time, even if you, I mean, Barack Obama did not have a lot of money when this venture began. He was able to get people excited because he had a message. George W. Bush had a message of a compassionate conservative. And so without that, without something behind the money, you could spend $1 billion and still lose an election. Having said that, if you have money, chances are you have a better shot of being elected than if you don't have money, and you certainly can't win with nothing. But there does come to the point of diminishing returns. You want enough money to get your message out, and at some point, in my thinking, if you see yet another campaign ad, it's like it's a turnoff. So you can get to the point where maybe too much money won't make a difference. You have to have the message. Yes?
I just want to follow up on that. The Citizens United decision. I guess I'm concerned that I see this positive feedback loop that the Supreme Court makes the Citizens United ruling, and now we can have very, very, very rich people bankroll, single billionaires bankrolling candidates. We've already seen it this year. And then they get their person into office who will then appoint more people to the Supreme Court who will reinforce or create more similar decisions, and we end up with an oligarchy.
Yeah, well, you're right. Well, I think you should always be worried because, your job as a citizen is to make sure that you hold Congress and government accountable. There are upwards of 35,000 lobbyists in Washington, and I'll take it from both sides of the aisle. The plus side is that they're out representing different points of view and different special interests, and that's their right under the Constitution. The downside is they're representing their own special interest, and it may negate some other interest of other organizations or other causes or other people. Yeah, but what the Supreme Court is going to say is that it is an issue of freedom of speech. And what is a corporation? Goes back to the comment that Mitt Romney made. And it was a 5-4 decision. So another justice could change the dynamics. We're going to see that as well with the health care debate. If it's a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court taking into account a key issue that affects each and every one of us. And I can't change it. It's the reality of what we're dealing with. It's going to be around for this campaign. It very well could be around from 2016 until there's another case that's brought forth. If you go back at the cases, though, that the court has decided, Buckley v. Vallejo, well, that was the most significant one because it basically said we can limit how much money you can contribute to a candidate, but the candidate can raise as much as he or she wants. And so that was a way of trying to control the spending. Citizens United basically changes that because you're right. Anyone who supports Mitt Romney or Barack Obama or Rick Santorum until about 4 days ago, able to spend their own money and do it under the auspices of, Freedom for America or, Red, White, and Blue Political Action Committee. We're paying for this because we think America is strong. We think that Barack Obama should be elected, or we think Mitt Romney should be elected. So, well, they do, but the beauty of the web is that you're able to get some information. But like America's Crossroads, we don't know all the people that are contributing. So as consumers of news, you also have to do your own due diligence. But it is the reality, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on which side of the aisle you're on. Yes?
You talked about Humphrey and Dirksen getting together. Who on the horizon? Who today are going to take on those roles?
That is a good question. I think here in Pennsylvania, I think Pat Toomey could be one of those people who has looked at the budget issue and might be able to do what Nixon did when Nixon went to China. Only Richard Nixon could go to China. Maybe only Pat Toomey could be the kind of person that says, in some areas we're going to raise taxes and we're going to cut spending in these areas. So he potentially, I think you need somebody who is well, or Paul Ryan in Wisconsin. This budget deficit cannot sustain itself. I mean, it has got to come under control. And if you look at the pie of the budget, it's not foreign aid. It's not education. Education is important, but those are not the big issues. The big issues are entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Defense is a significant part of the budget, but you've got to go after that first. You've got to say to yourself, well, okay, we're going to increase the retirement age to 67 or 69 as opposed to 65. And we're going to say to your generation, we're going to make some changes to Social Security. Whether you agree or disagree with how to solve the problem, the reality is that it used to be 15 or 20 to 1 back in the 1940s or 50s workers to Social Security recipient. We're now at the point of 2 to 1. I mean, that model cannot sustain itself. And so I think you need people on the left and on the right, maybe a Pat Toomey and a Claire McCaskill of Missouri would be the kind of people that can kind of come together in the next Congress, But there has got to be the political appetite to do that. It's not going to happen this year. Very little will happen in Washington this year. And you can only hope that whoever is president, who's ever the Speaker of the House, will sit down and really address the long-term issues. That is, I think, the hope and the desire. We'll see if it happens. Yes, Professor Pinsky.
Dr. Moran's comment and question. Democracy, since the country was founded, has always been messy. Politics has been messy. But this vitriol that we've seen maybe in the last 15 years or so, everything in your clips that you show, the lack of civility, the rudeness, the lack of respect. There was a time when Everett Dirksen did not hate Bobby Kennedy.
Right.
And when other Republicans didn't hate Democrats and Democrats didn't hate Republicans. But now it's, the ideology has become almost a religious fervor between
Sure.
both sides. When did that happen? Why did that happen? We see this not only with the politicians, but we see it on the editorial pages, the letters to the editor, with the people in the crowd.
Yep.
That kind of rudeness is going on. So my question is, when did it happen? How do we get back together as Americans who have disagreements but don't hate each other?
Well, I think I have a specific answer to your question, but I think if you go back and see what was written about George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or Madison and the criticism that the Founding Fathers faced, that level of criticism is just, it's at a higher decibel today because of technology, but it's certainly been around for 200 plus years. Specifically, though, I think the invention of the jet plane and air conditioning has changed significantly because Congress is now in session in the summer. And what that means is that members of Congress are working year-round. It also means that members of Congress are getting in the plane, coming back to their district, not talking to each other, not spending weekends together. Families aren't getting together. If you go back in the 1940s or 50s, Cokie Roberts, whose dad served in the House of Representatives, said that Lyndon Johnson used to come over to her house on weekends, and they used to, have branch bourbon, and the men would sit in the parlor and smoke cigars and talk politics, and they were mostly men at that time. And now it's, fortunately, 17% of Congress is made up of women. We need more. But they used to talk to each other, and they used to understand, Tip O'Neill gave a great story in an interview that we did with him shortly before he died. He said that, I'll never forget, on the morning of August 9th, 1974, one of the most traumatic days in American history, when Richard Nixon, the first and only president to face impeachment and to be forced out of office, to resign the presidency, he left that morning, very dramatic speech in the East Room of the White House, and then in came Gerald Ford, a breath of fresh air, and he talked about trying to heal the nation's wounds. Well, Tip O'Neill and Jerry Ford had been golfing buddies. They had served in Congress for 25 years. He walked into the Oval Office afterwards, had a meeting with Tip O'Neill, and Tip said to me, he said, "You know what, Jerry, isn't this country great?" He said, "You're a Republican, I'm a Democrat. I'm going to step out there any morning or any afternoon and beat the crap out of you, but we're going to be friends at the end of the day." And Tip O'Neill had that same approach with Ronald Reagan. They understood that politics was driven by partisanship and positions, but they also realized that they had to get along. The big problem today is, I think, in part redistricting. In part, you have, in California, for example, over 50 elections in 4 years, and I'm talking about congressional elections, the 54 congressional seats. In a 4-year period, only one in California changed from a Democrat to a Republican. And the re-election rate for members of Congress is at about 92 to 94%. But the problem that Democrats and Republicans face isn't the general election, it's the primary. They're worried about being, if a Republican were to support a tax increase, you can be sure that the Tea Party will be out there the next primary to get that person out of office. And if a Democrat is trying to go after cutting entitlement programs, there may be a more liberal Democrat going after that member. So those are the problems, and that's the reality that we're facing that I think has really changed the dynamics. So redistricting, technology, and the fact that we're not talking to each other because we're not spending enough time with each member. It's my way or the highway. I mean, the vote that we had on the health care bill, and I fault both parties on the health care bill. I think that had they really sat down and really worked out some sort of a health care bill that would have drawn the best of both parties, it would not have faced the challenge before the Supreme Court. But the Republicans voted against it. It now is being taken up by the court, and that very well could draw another line in the political sand 2012 and beyond. One or two more questions, anyone? Yes, Kim.
Speaking of the health care bill, that decision comes out, I believe, sometime
In
this
late
summer.
June.
How is that going to impact this presidential race?
Well, I think it will be huge. I think if the Supreme Court strikes down the health care bill, it's going to be, it will help reinforce the Republicans saying we were right. But it could also help, in a strange way, the Democrats, because the Democrats could then say, hey, look, if it's a 5-4 decision, if we had one more member of the Supreme Court that could overturn this decision, it's important to keep the president in the White House. And I think either party, they're both preparing the spin on this. So the Democrats are going to use this, I think, one way or the other. If it is sustained, if the court upholds the law, then that's going to embolden the Democrats. But it will also help the Republicans saying, this is untenable, you need to elect Mitt Romney, because if I'm not, if this law takes effect, then we're going to pay the price for health care, and so my job on day one is to, strike down the law. So each party is going to find some political benefit from it, no matter what the Supreme Court decides.
What's your sense of what's going to happen?
I have no idea. I really don't. I think that because the president has signaled, the Supreme Court has never in the past overturned a domestic policy issue, he might have some concerns that they will do so. If I had to guess today, I think that the individual mandate will probably be struck down, because if you listen to the questions, and I would like to say that C-SPAN can take credit for the audio being released the same day, not that we were directly responsible, but we did ask the court for cameras in the chamber. They declined, but they did release the audio the same day, so the chance to hear what was happening the day the court heard the case. By listening to the questions, you can kind of glean, well, maybe they are going to go after the individual mandate. Maybe that part will be struck down. And if that happens, we've already heard from the White House, then the whole bill is dead, because you cannot sustain the model unless everyone is in the pool. And that's really the premise that the Obama White House has said was fundamental in Massachusetts and what we want to do as a country. So, but it really, regardless of what the decision is, either party will turn this into a political issue that will very well carry you over to November. Yeah?
Steve, I was kind of intrigued by the president's little conversation with Medvedev over in Korea that
Yep.
caught on mic, saying he needs a little bit of time after the election to allow a lot more flexibility in terms of what's happening with us and the Russians. That's not uncommon for a president that's gotten reelected to basically have a whole lot of freedom because he doesn't have to worry about reelection.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think that'll mean for the Obama administration in terms of how he governs in a second term if that should happen?
Well, I think in a way he was right. He'll have a lot more flexibility because he won't have the political pressure of a campaign year that he's dealing with right now. But I also think that anytime you're reelected, the shackles of trying to raise money, those are gone. You don't have to worry anymore. You can really focus on setting your agenda and also your legacy. If you look at what Bill Clinton was trying to do before Monica Lewinsky, what Richard Nixon was trying to do before Watergate, and what George W. Bush was trying to do with Iraq and Afghanistan, was to try to focus on those pieces of his administration that he thought were critical to his legacy in the country. And it was obviously with mixed successes. Second terms are often difficult. We've seen that historically if you consider the second term of John Kennedy being Lyndon Johnson in Vietnam and the debacle that we faced in Vietnam. So I think what he was trying to bide with his conversation with Medvedev is he needs some more time, and that he won't feel the pressure that he feels right now, because no START treaty, no agreement is going to pass through the Senate. I mean, it's such a polarizing atmosphere right now, and will be through the general election, that he knows nothing will get done. So, but it is, in short, the political reality of any president seeking a second term, realizing that it's a lot better in the second term because you don't have to deal with the amount of time he spends just raising money.
Do you have a sense in terms of his particular presidency, what that'll mean?
No. In that question, I think, is the overriding issue of what is this re-election all about? I mean, in 1996, Bill Clinton had Bridge to the 21st Century. In 1984, it was Morning in America. We don't really have that in 2012. What does Barack Obama want to do? What's his message? Can you put it on a bumper sticker? Is there a way that you can transform, whether it's the issue of Russia and foreign policy or the domestic agenda. I mean, right now the campaign message is, well, I'm not Mitt Romney. I mean, and that's what they're trying to do, is to try to draw the difference between him and Mitt Romney. But he's going to have to come up with something, and he has time. When George Bush ran in 2000, he was the compassionate conservative. When George Herbert Walker Bush was running in 1988, it was a kinder, gentler America as he tried to get that third term of Ronald Reagan. So there has to be an overarching theme that he hasn't really spelled out. He's talked about the issues, economy, tax fairness, the Buffett rule, but he hasn't kind of put a ribbon to say, hey, this is what my campaign is all about. Yep, last question. Well, I grew up in a family with 12 brothers and sisters, and so if you ever want to come to a crazy house on Thanksgiving and deal with crazy aunts and uncles talking about politics, that's just an extension of what it's like. But, you know, this is a chance for you to weigh in on issues, and sometimes we'll try to gently get you off or cut you off, but we try to be a forum because it's really your chance to talk to these public officials. But sometimes it's hard, but for the most part, you just smile and keep going. Hey, thank you very much. It's been great to be with all of you. Appreciate it.